The morning my wife's old phone revealed her secret, I didn't scream. I didn't confront her. I didn't even finish my coffee. I simply sat there at the kitchen table, staring at a message that made my entire 4-year marriage feel like a carefully staged lie. And the worst part, the man texting her wasn't a stranger. It was my closest friend. My name is Caleb Mercer. And 3 weeks before my wife thought I would discover the truth, I already knew enough to destroy everything they had been hiding. But they had no idea. It started on a Tuesday morning. My wife, Nora, had left an old phone charging beside the living room lamp the night before. She told me she needed it because some files were backed up on it. I barely remembered the conversation. At 7:15 the next morning, I came downstairs, poured myself coffee, and noticed the phone glowing on the table. There was no passcode. I wasn't looking for anything. That is what makes what happened next so difficult to explain. I picked it up. The backup had finished restoring overnight. Then the messages appeared. The first one made me pause. The second made my stomach tighten. By the third, my hands had gone completely still. They were from Evan Cole, the man I had trusted enough to build my business with. 11 months of messages. 11 months of secret conversations between my wife and my best friend while I was traveling between Denver and Chicago, trying to expand our design company. I kept scrolling. Hotel reservations. Private dinners. Messages sent after midnight. Promises. Pet names. Plans for weekends when Nora told me she was visiting friends. Then I saw one sentence that made everything else disappear. I can't wait until he stops coming home. I stared at those words for a long time. My coffee sat untouched beside me. For nearly an hour, I didn't move. I remembered every goodbye kiss before my business trips. Every late-night phone call. Every time Nora told me she missed me. Every time Evan shook my hand and said, "We're going to make this company something huge." They hadn't just betrayed me. They had been building another life while I was building theirs. At 8:10, I heard Nora walking downstairs. My heart was pounding so hard I thought she might hear it. I locked the phone and placed it exactly where I had found it. Then I picked up my coffee. Nora entered the kitchen wearing the same soft smile she had worn every morning for 4 years. "You're up early," she said. I looked at the woman I thought I knew. "Couldn't sleep," I answered. She walked toward the coffee maker. "Want me to make you another cup?" I almost laughed. Instead, I smiled. "Sure." She turned around and kissed my cheek. That was the moment I understood something. If I confronted her immediately, I would get tears. Excuses. Denials. Maybe even blame. So I said nothing. For the next 3 weeks, I became the man nobody suspected. Every morning, I watched Nora pretend. Every night, I watched her sleep beside me while knowing exactly what she had done. And while she believed I was still unaware, I quietly began collecting everything. Because I wasn't preparing for an argument. I was preparing for the day the truth would become impossible for anyone to ignore. And 3 weeks later, Nora sat across from me at the dinner table and whispered 5 words that changed everything. "Caleb, I need to confess." She thought she was finally telling me her secret. She had no idea I had already discovered another one. Nora sat across from me, her fingers wrapped tightly around a glass of water. She had been crying before she even said anything. "Caleb, I need to tell you something." I looked at her and kept my face calm. "I know," I said. Her eyes widened. For half a second, I thought she knew that I had found the phone. Then she lowered her gaze. I made a terrible mistake. There it was. The sentence people use when they want to make a decision sound smaller than it really was. I said nothing. Nora took a shaky breath. It started months ago. Months. I already knew that. But hearing her say it out loud still felt like someone had reached inside my chest and squeezed my heart. She told me about Evan. She called it an emotional connection at first. Then a mistake. Then something that had simply gotten out of control. I listened. 11 months. That wasn't losing control. That was 11 months of choosing the same betrayal over and over again. I wanted to ask her how many times she had kissed me after seeing him. How many times she had told me she loved me after meeting him. How many nights she had watched me pack my suitcase for Chicago while knowing exactly what she was doing behind my back. But I didn't ask. I let her continue. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. "I'm pregnant." Everything inside me went silent. I stared at her. "How far along?" "Almost 4 months." I nodded slowly. Then came the question that mattered. "Is the baby mine?" Nora's face collapsed. She looked down at the table. "No." That single word hurt more than every message I had read. Not because I had believed the child was mine, but because she had known for weeks. She had looked me in the eyes every morning knowing another man's child was growing inside her. "How long have you known?" I asked. She swallowed. "About 5 weeks. 5 weeks. 5 weeks of breakfasts. 5 weeks of pretending. 5 weeks of asking me how my work was going." I suddenly understood why she had chosen tonight. The secret had become too heavy. Or maybe she had finally realized that hiding it was no longer possible. "I know this is devastating," she whispered, "but the baby is innocent. I need you to understand that." "I do." She looked surprised by my answer. "I don't blame the baby." Then I leaned back. "But I also can't pretend none of this happened." She began crying harder. She reached across the table, but I pulled my hand away gently. Not angrily. I simply couldn't let her touch me anymore. "I need time," I said. She nodded. I went upstairs that night and slept in the guest room. But I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked through the financial documents I had secretly collected during those 3 weeks. The affair was only one part of the story. Something about Evan's messages had bothered me. There were references to hotel rooms, company dinners, and expenses I couldn't explain. So I started checking our business accounts. At first, I found nothing. Then I noticed a charge from a hotel in Aurora. Then another. Then another. The amounts were small enough to disappear inside ordinary business expenses. But they appeared again and again. Same pattern. Same days Evan claimed he was meeting clients. I opened the company calendar. My stomach dropped. Those hotel charges matched Evan's supposedly off-site meetings. I stared at the screen. The affair had been personal. But now I was beginning to suspect something much worse. He hadn't only betrayed my friendship. He may have been stealing from the company we built together. And if that was true, Nora wasn't the only person who had been lying to me. I had been sleeping under the same roof as one liar, while trusting another with everything I had built. And the next morning, someone from Nora's family arrived at my house with a very different plan. They weren't coming to apologize. They were coming to convince me to stay. And they had no idea what I had already found. The next morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, Nora's mother, Marianne, stood there with her son, Graham, and her aunt, Evelyn. 3 people. One purpose. They walked into my house as if they had already decided what was going to happen to my marriage. Marianne sat across from me and folded her hands. "Caleb, we know this is difficult." I nodded. Graham leaned against the fireplace, arms crossed. He was the kind of man who believed confidence could solve anything. "Look, man," he said, "I'm going to be honest with you." I almost smiled. That sentence usually meant someone was about to tell me what I should do with my own life. "You need to think about Nora," Graham continued. "She's pregnant." "I know. The baby didn't do anything." "I agree." He looked at me, apparently surprised that I hadn't argued. Marianne leaned forward. "Nora needs support right now. She's scared. She's confused. She made a terrible mistake, but she still loves you." I looked down at my hands. That was the strange thing about betrayal. Everyone wanted to talk about the person who had made the mistake. Nobody wanted to talk about the person who had to live with it. Graham pushed himself away from the fireplace. "You're a good man, Caleb. If you stay, people will respect you. You'll be showing everyone that you're strong enough to keep your family together." I finally looked at him. "And if I leave?" He hesitated. "People might think you couldn't handle the pressure." There it was. Not concern. Pressure. They weren't asking me what I wanted. They were telling me what would make them comfortable. Marianne reached over and touched my hand. "We're not asking you to forget what happened." "Then what are you asking?" She paused. "Forgiveness." I looked at her for several seconds. I don't know if forgiveness means staying. Nobody answered. Evelyn, who had been quietly eating the cookies sitting on my counter, finally spoke. "Sometimes marriage means accepting things you never expected." I almost laughed. Accepting things. That was what they wanted from me. Accept the affair. Accept the pregnancy. Accept the lies. Accept the man who had betrayed me. And somehow call that maturity. Graham stepped closer. "Your decision will affect everyone." I nodded. "You're right." He seemed satisfied. Then I added, "That's exactly why I'm going to make it myself." The room became quiet. For the first time, none of them knew what to say. But they still believed I was undecided. They didn't know about the attorney. They didn't know about the documents hidden upstairs. And they definitely didn't know about the financial records sitting inside my locked desk. 2 days earlier, I had met with Rachel Whitmore, a family law attorney who had a reputation for being brutally practical. I had shown her everything. The messages, the pregnancy, the hotel charges, the company records. She hadn't looked shocked. She simply asked one question. Do you own a business with this man? Yes. Then don't make this only about the marriage. That sentence had stayed with me, because the more I investigated, the more I realized Evan's betrayal had gone far beyond Nora. I spent that afternoon going through years of business records, invoices, bank statements, expense reports, corporate card transactions, and then I found something that made me stop breathing for a moment. There was a payment I had never authorized. It wasn't huge, but it had been made from the company account to a private account connected to Evan. I checked another month, another payment, then another. My hands started shaking. This wasn't one mistake. It was a pattern. And suddenly, the affair wasn't the biggest problem anymore. I had spent years building that company. Evan had helped me build it. I trusted him with clients, money, contracts, and decisions I wouldn't have trusted to anyone else. While I was traveling to Chicago to expand our business, he had been quietly taking pieces of it for himself. That night, I sat alone in my truck outside my house. 15 minutes. That had become my routine. 15 minutes to feel everything I couldn't show inside. The betrayal, the humiliation, the grief. But that night, something changed. For the first time, I wasn't asking myself how I could survive what they had done. I was asking myself how much of my life I could rebuild once they were gone. And the answer was about to become very clear. Because the next file I opened contained a clause Evan had completely forgotten about. A clause that could cost him far more than his friendship with me. The next morning, I sat across from Rachel Whitmore in her office with a thick folder between us. She opened the folder and studied the business records I had collected. Hotel charges, private transfers, unapproved purchases, expense reports that didn't match Evan's calendar. She looked at me over the top of her glasses. How long have you been collecting this? About 3 weeks. She slowly closed the folder. Caleb, you've been very careful. I didn't want anger to make decisions for me. She nodded. Good. Because anger is exactly what Evan will expect. That sentence stayed with me. She pulled out our original partnership agreement. We had signed it years earlier when the company was nothing more than 2 laptops, a rented office, and a belief that we could build something bigger. I remembered that day. Evan had slapped me on the back and said, "One day we'll laugh about how small this place was." I believed him. Rachel flipped through the agreement. Then she stopped. Here. I leaned forward. She pointed to a section buried deep inside the contract. It stated that if one partner used company property, money, accounts, or working time for conduct that seriously violated fiduciary responsibilities, the other partner could trigger a forced restructuring of the partnership. That meant the person who had violated the agreement could lose control over major company assets. I stared at the page. Evan signed this. Yes. And he knows it's there? Rachel gave me a faint smile. He probably hasn't thought about it in years. Neither had I. Until now. She went through the evidence again. The company card charges weren't enough by themselves. But combined with the calendar records, hotel invoices, and private transfers, they created a pattern. I asked her the question that had been sitting inside me. What happens next? You don't confront him. I nodded. You don't warn him. Another nod. And you don't tell Nora what you're doing. I looked at her. Why? Because right now, everyone thinks your emotions are your weakness. She closed the folder. Let them. For the first time since finding the phone, I felt something other than grief. Not happiness. Not revenge. Something quieter. Control. Over the next several days, I kept living normally. I went to work. I spoke to Nora when necessary. I ate dinner at the same table. I answered her questions. But behind the scenes, Rachel and I prepared everything. I copied financial records, secured contracts, reviewed client agreements, separated personal documents, and created a complete timeline of Evan's transactions. There were 17 suspicious company charges. Then I found 3 more. 20. I printed every one. I highlighted the dates. Then I compared them with Evan's work calendar. Almost every suspicious charge happened on a day he had claimed to be meeting clients. But the locations told another story. Hotels, restaurants, private entertainment, places no client had any reason to be. I placed everything into a binder. On the cover, I wrote one simple word. Audit, not revenge. Not betrayal. Just audit. Because I wanted the evidence to speak louder than I ever could. Then, on a Thursday morning, Rachel sent the legal notice. At the same time, I sent the formal partnership dissolution request. Evan called me within minutes. I watched my phone vibrate across the desk. Once. Twice. 3 times. I didn't answer. Then he called again. Finally, a message appeared. Caleb, what is this? We need to talk. I read it twice. Then another message arrived. Don't destroy everything we've built. I stared at those words. Everything we built. I almost laughed. Because for years I had believed exactly the same thing. But now I knew the truth. He hadn't just risked our friendship. He had risked the company. And I wasn't going to destroy what we built. I was going to save what was still mine. By the end of that week, Evan's access to several company accounts had been frozen pending review. But I still hadn't told Nora. Because there was one final conversation I needed to have. Not with Evan. Not with Rachel. With Nora's mother. She had told me to stay. She had told me to forgive. She believed she knew the whole story. She didn't. And I had a feeling that once she saw the evidence, the family meeting would never look the same again. 2 days after the legal notice went out, I called Marianne. Could we meet somewhere private? She sounded nervous. Of course. Is something wrong? I almost told her everything over the phone. Instead, I said, there's something you need to see. We met at a quiet cafe across town. I arrived first and placed a thick folder on the table. When Marianne walked in, she smiled politely. Then she saw the folder. Her smile disappeared. Caleb, what is that? Everything I should have shown you before. She sat down. I pushed the folder toward her. She opened it. The first page showed a hotel charge. She frowned. What am I looking at? The date. She checked it. This was the weekend Nora told you she was visiting her friend. Marianne's eyes moved slowly across the page. She told me she was in Colorado Springs. I know. I turned to the next page. This was the hotel where she actually stayed. Marianne stopped breathing for a moment. With Evan? I nodded. She looked back at the page. Then came another document. Another date. Another hotel. Another expense. Her fingers began trembling. How long? Almost a year. She closed her eyes. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, I didn't know. I believe you. She looked at me. Why are you showing me this? Because when you came to my house, you asked me to accept what happened. Her expression changed. I thought I understood the situation. You didn't. I opened another section. This one is about the company. She stared at the pages. Private expenses. Unauthorized transfers. Company card charges. Financial records. Evan's name appeared repeatedly. Marianne slowly looked up. Did he steal from you? I'm letting the evidence speak for itself. She looked down again. Then I showed her one final page. A transaction connected to a personal account. Her face went pale. How could he do this? I didn't answer. Because I didn't have an answer that would make betrayal make sense. After several minutes, Marianne closed the folder. I defended her. I know. I told you to stay. I know. Her eyes filled with tears. I thought you were being cold. I looked at her quietly. I wasn't cold. My voice cracked slightly. I was broken. That was the first time I had allowed myself to say it out loud. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just broken. Marianne reached across the table. I'm sorry. I nodded. You don't have to apologize for something you didn't do. But I judged you. She wiped her eyes. I thought you were abandoning my daughter. I looked out the window. I was trying to save myself. The conversation ended quietly. No shouting. No accusations. Just 2 people sitting across from each other with a truth neither of us could undo. But I wasn't finished. There was still Graham. Nora's brother had been the loudest person telling me that leaving would prove I wasn't strong enough. So I asked him to meet me the following evening. He arrived expecting an argument. Instead, I placed the same folder in front of him. He opened it. 3 pages in, his expression changed. Where did you get this? The company's records. He kept reading. I didn't say anything. Eventually, he closed the folder. You knew all this? For weeks. He looked embarrassed. I didn't know. That's why I asked you to read it. He stared at the table. Then I reminded him of what he had told me. You said a man who leaves is a man who can't handle pressure. Graham swallowed. I shouldn't have said that. No. I shook my head. You shouldn't have said it without knowing the truth. He didn't argue. For once, there was nothing left to argue about. That night, I drove home feeling strangely lighter. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. Nora was still my wife. The divorce wasn't finished. The company was still being reorganized. And the future was still uncertain. But the people who had demanded that I accept the betrayal were finally seeing what I had been carrying alone. Then, just before midnight, my phone rang. It was Nora. I almost didn't answer. When I did, she didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She said only one sentence. "Caleb, Evan says you're trying to take everything from him." I closed my eyes. So Evan had finally realized what was happening. But then Nora said something that made my blood run cold. "He says there's something you don't know about the company." I sat up. "What did he tell you?" She hesitated. Then she whispered, "He says the money you're accusing him of taking wasn't the worst thing he did." And suddenly, I realized the evidence I had collected might only be the beginning. Nora's words stayed with me long after the call ended. The money you're accusing him of taking wasn't the worst thing he did. I sat alone in my office, staring at the dark window. For 3 weeks, I had believed I understood the betrayal. Nora had cheated. Evan had stolen company money. I had documented everything. But now I wondered what I had missed. The next morning I called Rachel. "I need you to investigate something." She didn't ask why. "Send me everything you have." I forwarded the records. 2 hours later, she called. "Caleb, I found something." My stomach tightened. "What?" "There are several transfers connected to a holding account." "What kind of account?" "One that wasn't listed in the company's primary financial records." I stood up. "You're telling me Evan had another account?" "Not exactly." She paused. "It appears the account was created using company information, but your name isn't attached to it." I felt a cold sensation move through me. "Can you trace where the money went?" "Some of it." "Where?" She named a small consulting company I had never heard of. I wrote the name down. Then she added something that made my hands go numb. "Caleb, the company has been receiving payments from several clients that never appeared in our main account." I stared at my desk. Clients. Payments. Missing revenue. This wasn't just someone stealing from the company. Someone had been creating a second financial pipeline right under my nose. I spent the rest of the morning going through old contracts. Then I found something. A client I personally brought into the company had signed a renewal agreement 8 months earlier. I remembered that contract, but the version in our system wasn't the version I remembered signing. The payment schedule had been changed. The destination account was different, and the signature on the revised document looked like mine. Except I hadn't signed it. I called Rachel immediately. "Can you verify this signature?" She was quiet. "Yes. And it's not yours." I closed my eyes. Evan hadn't simply taken money. Someone had forged my signature. That changed everything. Rachel told me not to confront him. So I didn't. Instead, I called the client directly. The woman who answered recognized my name immediately. "Caleb, we've been trying to reach your office for weeks." My heart sank. "What about?" "We thought your company was shutting down." "Why would you think that?" "Because Evan told us you were restructuring the business. He asked us to redirect our payments." I gripped the phone tighter. "Did he say where?" She gave me the account details. It matched the account Rachel had found. I thanked her and ended the call. For several minutes, I simply sat there. Evan hadn't been preparing for our partnership to fail. He had been preparing to leave with pieces of it. And Nora had known something. Maybe not everything, but enough to warn me. That evening, Nora came home. She looked exhausted. I didn't accuse her. I simply asked, "How much did you know?" She froze. "About what?" "The second account." Her face changed. That was my answer. She sat down slowly. "I didn't know everything, but you knew something." She started crying. "Evan told me he was moving money temporarily." "Why?" "He said the company was going to have problems." I stared at her. "Did you believe him?" She shook her head. "At first. And later?" She wiped her face. "Later, I knew something wasn't right." "Then why didn't you tell me?" She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Because by then, I was afraid of losing everything." I almost whispered, "You already had." She lowered her head. For the first time, I saw something different in her face. Not guilt. Fear. Real fear. And that scared me more than her confession. Because if Nora was afraid of Evan, there was a possibility that the affair wasn't the only thing holding them together. I leaned forward. "What aren't you telling me?" She looked toward the hallway. Then back at me. And finally, she said something that made my entire plan change. "Evan knows where you keep the original company records." I went completely still. Because those records weren't at the office anymore. They were upstairs in my home. And suddenly, I wasn't worried about what Evan had already taken. I was worried about what he might do next. I went upstairs immediately. The house was silent. Too silent. I walked into my office and looked at the locked cabinet where I kept the original contracts, financial statements, and company records. The lock was still intact. I opened it. Everything was there. But something felt wrong. I checked the folders one by one. Then I noticed it. One of the original partnership agreements had been moved. Only slightly. Someone had opened the cabinet. I called Rachel. I think someone has been inside my office. Her voice became serious. Don't touch anything else. I stepped away. She contacted the authorities and arranged for the documents to be photographed and secured. Then we checked the house security footage. At first, there was nothing. Then we found a recording from 2 nights earlier. A figure entered through the side door. The face wasn't visible, but I recognized the jacket. Evan, my best friend. The man who had once stood beside me when we opened our first office. The man who had cried at my wedding. He had entered my home while I was asleep, and he had been looking for those documents. I felt something inside me go cold. Not rage. Something deeper. Disappointment. Because there was a point where betrayal stops being shocking. It simply becomes confirmation. Rachel asked me to let her handle everything. So I did. The next morning, the legal team sent Evan a formal notice requiring him to preserve all company records and financial data. This time, he didn't call me. He sent an attorney. That told me everything I needed to know. He knew the situation had become serious. Within days, the financial investigation expanded. The missing money was larger than I originally believed. Several client payments had been redirected. Some contracts had been altered. And the evidence showed that Evan had been preparing his own private operation for months. The affair with Nora had been part of his secret life. But the business scheme had been something else entirely. It had been planned. Carefully. Patiently. And while I had been traveling to Chicago, he had been moving pieces into place. Then came the meeting. Evan sat across from me in a conference room with his lawyer beside him. For the first time in years, we were sitting on opposite sides of a table. He looked tired. Caleb, he said quietly, we can still fix this. I looked at him. You broke the partnership. I made mistakes. You forged documents. His lawyer shifted in his chair. Evan looked down. I never wanted it to go this far. I almost smiled. That's the problem with betrayal. He looked up. You always think you can control how far it goes. Silence. I pushed a document across the table. It was the partnership agreement. The same clause Rachel had discovered. The one Evan had forgotten. You signed this, I said. He stared at it. Then he understood. His face changed completely. Under the agreement, his misuse of company assets and falsification of records gave me grounds to assume control of major intellectual property and client contracts. The business he thought he was quietly taking apart was no longer his to control. The negotiations lasted several days. When they ended, I kept the company's core intellectual property, major client relationships, and the office operations. Evan walked away with far less than he expected. But I wasn't finished. There was still Nora. The divorce proceedings began shortly afterward. I didn't fight her over every possession. I didn't try to destroy her. I simply wanted my life back. And then something unexpected happened. 6 of our biggest clients contacted me independently. They wanted to continue working with me. Not Evan. Me. That was when I realized something important. I had spent years thinking the company was what I had built. But the real thing I had built was trust. And trust couldn't be stolen with a signature. Within weeks, I began planning a new company. A smaller one. Cleaner. Mine. No partner. No secret accounts. No person I had to wonder about. One evening, I sat alone in my apartment looking at the empty room. For months, I had been afraid of what life would look like after Nora. Now I was beginning to see it differently. It wasn't empty. It was mine. Then my phone rang. It was Marianne. Her voice was quiet. Caleb, I owe you something. I thought she meant another apology. She didn't. She said she had just learned something about Nora and Evan that even I didn't know. Something that could change the entire divorce. And when I heard what it was, I realized the final secret had been sitting in front of me all along. Marianne called me on a Friday evening. I was sitting alone in my new apartment, looking through paperwork for the company I was preparing to launch. Caleb, she said quietly, I need to tell you something. I waited. I found out that Nora knew about Evan's financial plan much earlier than she admitted. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I felt nothing. Then came the familiar ache. Not because I was surprised. Because I had hoped there was still one part of my marriage that had been real. How much did she know? She knew he was moving money. She knew he was preparing something. She didn't know every detail, but she knew enough. I thanked Marianne. Then I sat in silence. That was the final piece. Nora hadn't planned Evan's scheme. But she had seen the warning signs. And she had chosen silence. The next time I saw her, I didn't shout. I didn't ask why. I already knew the answer. Fear. Selfishness. Denial. Sometimes people don't betray you because they hate you. Sometimes they betray you because protecting themselves becomes more important than protecting you. Our divorce was finalized several months later. I walked out of that courthouse alone. No celebration. No dramatic feeling of victory. Just relief. I had spent months fighting to recover my life, and suddenly there was nothing left to fight for. I went home and opened the first box for my new company. I named it Mercer Creative Group. My name. My work. My responsibility. No partner. No secrets. No shared accounts I couldn't trust. 6 former clients followed me. Then 2 more. Within 3 months, I had hired 5 people. The strange thing was that the business grew faster than I expected. Not because I was lucky. Because I finally understood what had mattered all along. People weren't loyal to a logo. They were loyal to the person who answered when things went wrong. I had spent years flying across the country for clients. Taking red-eye flights. Missing dinners. Solving problems nobody else wanted. I thought I was building a company. I was really building a reputation. And that reputation survived. Evan's company eventually disappeared. The accounts were settled. The legal issues were resolved. I never celebrated what happened to him. He had made his choices. So had Nora. I didn't need to punish either of them. Their consequences were already living with them. Months later, Marianne called again. I want to apologize one more time. You don't have to. I told you to stay. I know. I was wrong. I smiled. Sometimes people make decisions with incomplete information. She sighed. And you? I learned something. What? Acceptance isn't surrender. There was silence. Then I continued. You can accept that someone hurt you without accepting that they get to decide what happens to the rest of your life. That was the truth I had learned sitting alone in my truck night after night. For 15 minutes, I had allowed myself to grieve. Then I went back inside. I worked. I rebuilt. I kept moving. Eventually, those 15-minute nights stopped. I didn't need them anymore. One Friday evening, I cooked dinner in my apartment. Nothing special. Just pasta, music, and an open window. I looked around the quiet room. For the first time, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. It belonged to me. I thought about Nora. I didn't hate her. I didn't forgive everything she had done either. I simply stopped carrying it. That was the difference. Some people think revenge means destroying the people who hurt you. I learned something different. Sometimes revenge is refusing to let their actions destroy you. Evan took money. Nora took my trust. But neither of them took my future. They couldn't. Because my future wasn't theirs to take. I rebuilt my company. I rebuilt my confidence. And most importantly, I rebuilt the man I had been before I started believing someone else's betrayal defined my worth. I once thought losing my marriage was the end of my life. It wasn't. It was the moment I finally stopped living a life built around people who didn't deserve the sacrifices I was making. So if there's one thing I want you to remember from my story, let it be this. When someone betrays you, you don't have to become cruel. You don't have to scream. You don't have to destroy everything around you. Sometimes you simply get quiet. You gather the truth. You protect yourself. And then you walk away with your dignity intact. Because the strongest revenge isn't watching someone else fall. It's standing up after they tried to break you, and realizing you can build something even better without them. That is exactly what I did. And for the first time in years, when I looked at my life, I didn't see what they had taken. I saw everything they had failed to take. Me.